Salim, given China's reluctance to share information, giving disinformation, not coming out as soon as they could have about the coronavirus, do you think there's a case to have them indicted and brought before the International Criminal Court on charges of crimes against humanity given the outcome and the thousands of deaths?
Yes, there is a case. Definitely there is a case. Whether it will be done or not is another issue. But there is a case in the sense, we now know what has happened over the past several months. Wuhan, capital of Hubei province in China, is in a sense the crime scene. The crime scene where coronavirus originated, how it originated, who it infected, how it was transmitted, and all the while the Chinese Communist government kept it hidden, was not transparent about it, did not inform people. By the time the word got out, that is, after the lunar year shutdown in China, which was in January, and the Chinese did not open, the government did not allow the opening of businesses in China, offices in China, especially in the Hubei province, Wuhan. Word got out of what was taking place. And then when the Chinese went into the lockdown and the quarantine of not only the city of Wuhan with a population of over 11 million people, but the Hubei province, it was already too late. The matter had become, in a sense, global.
And of course, during all of this time, there are flights in and out of Wuhan and Hubei province throughout the world spreading the virus.
Exactly, and Chinese workers who were traveling back and forth between their mother country, China mainland, and abroad, carried with them the virus, or they were infected and they transmitted the virus. And we can see, in Europe, the country that is the worst affected, Italy and Austria, but Italy predominantly is the worst affected. A lot has to do with the expatriate Chinese workers working in Italy and Italians and other people of other ethnic background or nationalities that were working in Italy, and that infected the population. By the way, the issue did not simply emerge as it is being talked about in the mainstream media.
I'm not surprised.
No, it is not surprising at all. And we need to talk about that and get into that aspect of it. The corporate media in North America, both the Canadian and of course the American, that the coronavirus problem erupted in December and then began spreading through January when the Chinese put Wuhan and Hubei province in a lockdown. What we now know and what we now can draw the dots, connect the dot and make the inference is the very first person who identified the problem was a Chinese doctor, Dr. Liang, who brought this matter to the notice of the authorities in China, in Beijing, that there had been an unexpected rise in number of people who were his patient. He was seeing them one-on-one with a flu problem, and it was not at that time, at that moment, exactly identified by Dr. Liang that this is coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, but it was an unusual strain of virus that was affecting the people. And he brought this to the notice of the Chinese authority. The people that he was seeing were not simply people in December. It went back into the fall in China. So November, October, and the patients were rising in numbers. And what happened to Dr. Liang when he brought this into the notice was that the Chinese government quarantined him, in fact made him a prisoner, imprisoned him, and he subsequently is the first victim, in a sense, martyr, you might say, who died as a result of the virus that he brought to the attention of the Chinese people.
I find that, and I'm not the only one, very suspicious that here's this young, healthy man succumbs to the virus, and yet the mortality rate for his cohort, his age and gender and health, no preconditioning conditions that anybody's aware of, the fact that he died is very suspicious, especially when a communist state that made him sign an apology, I think, to the Communist Party in China for daring to go against doctrine and come out here and spread the news of this, well, what turned out to be a pandemic. So, did he succumb to the virus? I really wonder.
Yeah, I mean, everything about now, I mean, you open your observation with whether the Chinese government and Chinese authorities, especially the leadership, can be indicted for what might well be described as crime against humanity under the circumstances that now it is a global pandemic and it has spread way beyond the Chinese territory. That everything about China is suspect, and the circumstances under which Dr. Liang died, we are not aware of it. We are not being given the information.
No, we'll never know either.
And we will never know. No. So here we need to talk about China as a society, as a country. But sticking to this very specific issue about the eruption, which according to the mainstream media is being bracketed around December, and what we can now infer, it goes way back into the fall. So the Chinese authorities knew about this problem several months ahead of what the world got to know, or in this case the Americans got to know, and that the first action by the American administration, that is President Trump, was to ban flights out of China.
We'll get into that for sure, because the responses of the rest of the world is a topic I'd like to cover. But back to the indictment, or at least the complicity in the Chinese Communist Party, because that's China, the Chinese Communist Party. Nothing happens in China that they don't know about or orchestrate. I remember seeing videos on Twitter of people laughing in the streets and hugging each other, saying, we trust the Communist Party of China, we trust our government, we wear no masks, we're not afraid. Those videos, of course, are telling the world that this is nothing to worry about, don't protect yourself, when the exact opposite would have, and probably could have, saved lives. Again, the complicity of this Communist Party and this communist country, I think, is writ large, and these should be indicted.
And
not that it will ever happen.
No, it won't happen. And this is not the first instance that they should be indicted for. There's a whole number of issues that we can talk about, and we should talk about to put this matter into the proper context. But those young people who were waving and laughing and hugging and cheering, these were all staged operations.
Of course.
And we can also see that these are stage operations that has been extended offshore. We have now seen videos and Twitter feeds of expatriate Chinese in Italy standing outside the Colosseum and in Rome, wearing masks to gain sympathy, and people going and hugging them.
I've seen that, yes.
And so this is also
taking off his mask and his shield at his eyes and hugging them. It's just outrageous.
That's right, and drawing sympathy that, China is not by itself, others are now in it, whereas the issue that should be raised is, it came out of China, that it is the government of China that did not take the measures to inform the rest of the world, and particularly the World Health Organization. And we need to talk about that, the complicity of the World Health Organization and its present executive director,
Yes.
a man by the name of Tedros Adhanom,
A communist.
of
From
communist
Ethiopia.
or of Marxist background.
Yes.
And we need to talk about that. So
Maybe we should rename this flu, instead of the Chinese coronavirus, as President Trump quite correctly calls it, maybe we should call it the communist virus, because there are so many links to communism that help this virus spread. One is the suspicion that it came out of a lab. You can get into that a little more detail, because I think you know about it more than I do.
Yeah.
Came out of one of their virus labs. The second is the Communist Party's disinformation, suppression of information, which can really only be seen in a communist dictatorship. And the third is, of course, the communist head of the World Health Organization. Again, he is suspect in whatever he does, because I understand that he was part of an Ethiopian coup, and his group that he was a part of, in the upper echelons of, was labeled a terrorist organization. And here he is, not a doctor, heading the World Health Organization. So perhaps the communist flu might be a better name for this virus.
Well, Gordon Chang, who is a very well-known author, a writer, Chinese origin, and now a regular commentator in various news outlets in the United States, particularly Fox News. Gordon Chang, on this matter, has pointed out that yes, President Trump is not only right to talk about the Wuhan virus, and you are now talking about the communist virus, but he has also said that it is not simply Wuhan virus. China's communism itself is a virus, is a disease.
Yes. Which kills millions and tens of millions over the last 700 years.
And the Chinese people are the first victim of the disease that is Chinese communism or Maoism.
I remember thinking that when we saw the poor eating habits and hygiene of the Chinese people, especially in the inland, which you have visited, I remember thinking that what kind of society exists so that people have to eat bats and vermin and insects, that's where they get their sustenance. And of course the answer is communist society, which can't feed its people properly, which is not a modern society.
Absolutely. I mean, at the bottom line, China is still very much a third world or fourth world country.
Fourth world, yes.
You know, the coastal areas, and people go gaga about it, and well, you know, people can go gaga, and in the last 25, 30 years, China has made immense gains that we can talk about, and we should talk about, and how it has come about with the complicity of the Western powers, you know. That, in a sense, taken the entirety of China together, the coastal cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Canton, Guangzhou, these are Potemkin cities in the sense, you know, they're only a facade over what the reality of China is, which is a third world country, fourth world country, not much different than most of Africa, most of part of the world that I come from or was born, India. So immense poverty. And so the food habits or the cultural habits or the lack of hygiene in this heavily populated country. And the interior is a result of lack of development or the culture and the people still living in pre-modern conditions, you know, where septic tanks and hygiene are not readily available for the masses. People still need to go into outdoor contraptions for their daily, you know, reasons, purposes, you know. So, yeah, and the eating habits, I mean, it's 1.4, 1.5 billion people, and they have to survive. And so they have to survive and get the protein intake from wherever they can get.
And I don't blame them for doing what
No,
they're doing
you can't
because
blame them, and
they're
nobody,
struggling.
yeah, it's not even. But on the other hand, it is an eating habit that is completely different in that sense from the eating habits of any other people, especially third world, fourth world, and first world, Canada, United States, Europe. And so the rapid transmission that has taken place and has affected us. And that comes back to the responsibility and therefore the accountability we are talking about here. The communist government being held responsible and accountable by the rest of the world, in this case, the United Nations. If the United Nations was truly a functional organization, which it is not. United Nations is driven by its own agenda, a globalist agenda, and United Nations is, in more ways than we can hold accountable, a very dysfunctional organization, very lopsided in terms of its own accountability because of the way the membership is distributed. And so there you have it. You have the executive director of the World Health Organization responsible for the health of the world, in the sense to monitor it and to keep track of what is happening on any number of issues related with our living condition in a highly globalized world with rapid communication, transportation, travels. And you have somebody from Ethiopia, which is another third world country, who is not a doctor, as he just pointed out. He's not a physician, has no background in medicine, who served in the Ethiopian government first as his health minister, Minister of Health, and then subsequently as foreign minister. And that is the connection which brings him to run for this position of
He became part of the elite.
He was part of the global elite.
Yes.
And given the backing of other African countries, the African Union, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and countries connected with China. I mean, here, by the way, what you and I are doing, and let me make this point as we go forward, we are putting things in context, which the mainstream media doesn't do, which is not done enough. In fact, in our education system, I would tell my students repeatedly that any event or anything or any individual needs to be put into context so that you have a framework for analysis, and that to have perspective, to get deep, you must have a comparative understanding, because a thing cannot be analyzed in itself and by itself. It needs to be analyzed in a comparative sense with others. So that's what we are doing here. And this divergence of talking about the executive director, Tedros, is part of this contextual analysis. So Ethiopia has become a main hub for China in a scheme called Road and Belt expansion of China, to draw other countries and other parts of the world, other regions, into this Chinese ambition to become the next world power and eliminate or push aside what has been, at least since the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're going back 30 years, and the dominance, what the Europeans started calling US hegemony, that the United States is the global power, the global leader, and so that's the competition. China has become, in that sense, the second largest world economy, and people are anticipating, or were anticipating before this coronavirus pandemic, that China is on the route to becoming, by the middle of this century, the largest world economy in terms of GDP. So Ethiopia is one of the hubs in Chinese penetration in Africa. Africa is one of the continents that China is very, very carefully manipulating and penetrating. I have seen that. Again, in my travels into Africa, North Africa, Chinese are building roads and highways linking north-south in the African countries. Chinese are developing natural resources in North Africa, in Algeria, for instance. Chinese investment is in the oil and gas. Algeria is one of the major oil-producing countries, natural gas-producing countries for the European market. And Chinese have been very active in helping or investing in building up of oil refineries and oil tankers, land tankers for as reservoirs. So the Chinese penetration is very heavy in Africa, as it is in the Middle East, as it is in other parts of South and Southeastern Asia. But the Ethiopian thing is very, very interesting because of this man, Tedros Adhanom. I hope I have the pronunciation right, and his role. And as you have correctly pointed out, his communist or Marxist background, because he was a member of the People's Liberation Army of Tigray province, with going back to Mengistu, who was a declared Marxist leader of Ethiopia. And so here he becomes the executive director of World Health Organization in 2017. And the first thing he does is he appoints Robert Mugabe. At that time, he's now dead and gone, but in 2017, the notorious Robert Mugabe, the dictator of Zimbabwe, as the World Health Ambassador. It raises all sorts of question marks.
So this is the person, this is the organization that leaders like Justin Trudeau or even Donald Trump or the world are taking advice from. So when this communist thug comes out there and says, we now have a pandemic, is he just being a mouthpiece for the more intellectual people and the real doctors behind him in the World Health Organization? Or is he trying to stir the pot, cause the panics that we're seeing right now?
Well, there are a number of things riding on this issue that we have, focusing on right now in our conversation. One thing is that he was responsible, Tedros was responsible to give a sort of a clean bill of health, in a sense, that the Chinese are doing the right thing in dealing with the problem, and they're up to speed, and so not to worry about China. That came out of the World Health Organization under his leadership, and to the extent that particularly the third world countries, the African countries, African Union. By the way, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was traveling in Africa when all of this was breaking out.
Buying votes.
Getting African Union, in other words, also Ethiopia,
yes.
and dishing out money to countries in that part of the world on any number of projects, which is his fascination with, including transgender and gender issues. While the pandemic was, at that time, it had not been declared a pandemic by WHO, but it had already surfaced. And Justin Trudeau was traveling there. So you can see this sort of interconnection. And of course, the European Union, with their relationship with the African Union, their support for the UN organization, people like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron of France. So you can see this is a very much a world elite organization that is the people in positions of authority and power who are running these UN agencies. It is very much incestuous. They are self-electing, self-perpetuating leadership, and nobody is holding anybody accountable. And we can go back, and look at the UN record in dealing with crises and catastrophes. Rwanda, Kofi Annan, who totally failed on Rwanda, became the UN Secretary General as a reward for his failure. Or before him, Boutros Ghali, who totally failed on the collapsing nature of what now we know and we call failed states in Somalia. And he ended up becoming the Secretary General of the United Nations. So we can see that the elite organizations and elite members, they take care of themselves. And that's where China comes in. China is, in that sense, the panacea for the elite organization who are making money out of China, who support China, who had given China the preferred treatment by first bringing China into the World Trade Organization without demanding from China reciprocity and transparency on trade issues. And now you come back to the pandemic 30 years later, or that is when China was brought into the WTO almost 30 years later. It was in 1992, 1993. But yes, the question is it only this? Is this one isolated instance or a series of things?
Oh, there's a myriad of things.
Right. I mean,
from the treatment of Uyghurs to their organ harvesting, all of that kind of a thing, to their warmongering, to their relationship with
right
Taiwan.
Now having a concentration camp with the Uyghur Turks, the Muslim Uyghur Turks, the devastation in Tibet. In fact, they have done ethnic cleansing in Tibet.
Yes.
Nobody has paid attention to what the Tibetan leadership in exile, Dalai Lama, has been talking about for the last 50 years.
Now, there's a whole, as you say, a whole series
of
events.
But coming back to the Wuhan issue and the transmission, Dr. Li Wenliang's death that has been hidden away, who brought this to the notice. Now we know that the level 4 safety lab in Wuhan is the only lab that the Chinese have in Wuhan, Hubei province, where these germs and biological pathogens are being developed, that the coronavirus possibly was either deliberately or by mishandling, because given the third world status of China, however much security is being put together or has been put together by the Chinese authority, the level 4 lab, the people still operating in those labs are people with that cultural background, which I've just mentioned. It's still a third world country. And there are reports that we now know that animals that were being used in the lab for testing and for experimentation, monkeys and dogs and rabbits and other creatures, these animals were sold into the market and ended up in the meat market, which is about 20 kilometers, the main meat market in Wuhan, 20 kilometers from the lab, and were sold, all illegally done, no proper record kept. The protocol is to destroy these animals after the test and cremate them and remove them. But they went into the food chain. It was digested and ingested by people. So that's where the patient that Dr. Li Wenliang was seeing coming up with this problem that he identified and brought it to the Chinese notice, we can now see that the Chinese authorities didn't pay attention or couldn't be bothered about it, and it exploded. It exploded by the time they took action. And here we are where we are. To wrap this up, I might make the final observation. The Chinese, according to the latest numbers that we know, as of today, according to the Johns Hopkins stats Johns Hopkins Medical School stats, and those stats that are available, that is, the American government is using it, we are close to somewhere around about a little over 200,000 worldwide that have been affected and who have been identified. If it is 200,000, we can raise it by several notches, people who have not been tested, because that's a huge problem. Of that 200,000, around about 81,000 is Chinese number. So almost, one quarter is Chinese. And of that 81,000, over the last 2 weeks, the numbers have stabilized. China has, of the 81,000, I think the numbers of death has been in the range of 6,000 plus. But that 81,000 has stabilized. There has been no new addition, and the curve is going down. The same thing has happened with the South Koreans. That's the next highest numbers, and the South Korean numbers have also stabilized. The question is, the virus that has spread outside China, when will that number peak and stabilize? And at what number it will peak and stabilize? We don't know. The estimates range from a couple of million to several million before it stabilizes and become normal. So that's where the situation is. But you're absolutely right. The Chinese need to be held accountable.
Now, when I asked whether or not they should be indicted and brought before the International Criminal Court, of course it was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because we both know that that'll never happen. There are just too many vested interests to maintain the status quo with China. But could there be pressure from the people or popular expression to convince people in the West, the leaders, Trump, Trudeau, in Europe, to distance themselves economically from that communist regime? I understand that a lot of the pharmaceuticals that we rely on, especially in the United States, come from China, and that is an unacceptable condition, I think, that we're just learning now, that we should rethink the dependency on such a brutal regime and untrustworthy regime. Besides that, perhaps we could even talk about compensation. That when, for example, Iran is fomenting terrorism, what happens in the United States? They held them accountable financially and seized accounts. Could something like that happen with China?
Well, of all the world leaders, Trump is the only leader, singular, I might say, and therefore in that sense unique, that doesn't need any convincing of what he has said. In fact, he's far ahead of the curve. And he was the one who was calling to attention before the 2016 election. And in fact, it became Trump's campaign theme, and that is still ongoing, that the United States need to reorient and restructure its relationship with China. And that's what Trump was the one who raised the issue of trade. Trump was the one who talked about how this massive transfer of wealth has taken place over the last quarter century and more, that is unprecedented in history. And that the fact that China has emerged as the second largest world economy in terms of the GDP in such a short period of time, between 1992, 93 to where we are now. Trump's election was in 2016, so that period, quarter century, is unprecedented. And what he was calling for, I mean, he focused on trade, both NAFTA, because Canada and Mexico was being used by the Chinese as a dumping ground to access into the US market. But the very fact that industries had pulled up from the United States, American industries had pulled up from the United States, lock, stock, and barrel, and gone to China. or leading edge industries and technology, such as iPhones, Apple, Microsoft, and others, had gone into China and set it up. And that in this 25 years, China had become, in a sense, the supply chain for the industrialized world, particularly for North America and Europe. Auto parts, you just now mentioned, pharmaceutical, almost all the generic drugs now is manufactured out of China and India. In fact, on the generic drug side, 80% plus of the drugs come from China and India, you might say. 50, half and half, 40%, 40%, or 50%, 50% of that 80%, or the Chinese might have a little edge on this. On almost all the major antibacterial drugs, China is now the supply chain. And so the dependency, which was never there in the 1990s, is now almost full-blown for pharmaceutical industry, auto parts industry, our IT industry. Plus, the Chinese have been engaged in stealing the Western, knowledge. So the theft of knowledge was rampant going on.
As was the theft of copyrighted
Effects and patents,
yes.
and so on. So Trump warned about that, and he said that he's going to bring back the trade. I mean, it was almost, in a sense, atrocious, Robert, that the Americans were running $500 billion annual deficits, $500 billion plus annual deficit. It is unsustainable. One of two things will happen. It is unsustainable. The country running that sort of deficit will break down and will become dependent on the other side, or it has to be reversed, and it can go into a conflict which very rapidly can change from a trade war into a physical conflict.
No, I certainly hope that it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, so Trump has been way ahead of the curve, and he's been correcting that, It's about the others. It's about us in Canada. It is our Prime Minister whose infatuation with the Chinese is now no longer simply a trade problem or a security problem in that sense of our national security interest. It has become a mortal problem. This coronavirus is a red light on all of us.
I want to talk about Trudeau, but let's just first of all talk about the one leader who did anything at the beginning, and that, of course, was President Trump, because I understand that within 5 days of the identification of the virus in China and all that, he imposed a travel ban for people who had visited China. And people at the time, Nancy Pelosi in particular, called it racist. Oh, I don't know that she actually used that word. I think she
xenophobic.
used xenophobic.
And that's what Biden said.
Yes, and now, of course, they're singing a different tune, but Trump is still being pilloried by these people suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, because the man can do no right in their eyes, even when he does right and saves lives. So Trump came out first out of the gate, imposed a travel ban. And now you've seen other countries, Italy, Germany, now Canada. Lo and behold, the borderless world, Justin Trudeau, who doesn't even believe in nation states or borders, all of a sudden has recognized and acknowledged that Canada does indeed have a border and has imposed a travel ban. So let's talk about Trump then, and these deluded people who are trying to make hay out of this. Remember, at the time that this virus was growing, what was going on in the news regarding Trump? The impeachment.
Exactly. I mean, again, there are different elements over here. You talked about Justin Trudeau and the European leaders, Italian, German, French, Of course, Britain moved out of Brexit. They successfully completed that project. As of January 31st, Britain is no more part of the European Union, so the European Union leaders, what is their position? And you're absolutely right. Trump was ahead of the curve, ahead of everybody. He called the shot. He has been, in a sense, he and his people around him, but he's the leader, and he has brought this on the table in public conversation and in the public agenda, that we have to reorient our relationship with the Chinese. And now I think people are waking up to the fact. You talked about in your opening remarks about whether we can indict the Chinese or whether the Chinese will be indicted, because this is a clear example of accountability and responsibility. I mean, can there be a sort of a Nuremberg trial for the Chinese leadership? We can only hope for. I don't think it's going to happen, but there it is. But the reverse is also there. I might point out: will Americans leaders be held accountable for the past 25, 30 years, who basically not only embraced China, but went on knowingly to deindustrialize America and make America so heavily dependent on a country that you cannot trust, for the same simple reason that the Chinese people don't trust their country. That is a 1.4 billion people prison. I mean, to put it in a proper sense, China is one massive gulag, a prison, just as the Soviet Union was. I mean, the very first victims of Chinese communists are the Chinese people, as Gordon Chang spoke about. So, I mean, we can run through this history from 1949 under Mao Zedong, where Mao Zedong himself alone, and that is as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, is responsible for anywhere up to 100 million Chinese dead through forced marches, through famines that were artificially created, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the internal warfare. This is an astronomical figure. It is at times outside the comprehension of the people, ordinary people. To tell my students about this, how do you comprehend that one man or one system was responsible for numbers that is, beyond 3 times, 4 times the population of Canada that was eliminated in China. But then comes what happened after Mao Zedong died in 1976 and the internal struggle that went on. And then Deng Xiaoping came to power, or his people came to power, and the West embraced him, But Deng Xiaoping was an unrepentant communist. He was a guy who said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is a white cat or a black cat, so long it is efficient and effective in getting the mouse, that is, getting the job done. And he was going to open and embrace whatever is to get China rapidly on the path to development. But it wasn't going to be giving up the Chinese communist system and embracing, as part of the modernization of China, anything to do with a representative democratic government, which is what India is, by the way. With all of India's problem, India is an open, liberal, democratic government based on a constitution. Now, how effective it is another question, but it's an open society in that sense of the term. So here we have Deng Xiaoping comes to power, and then what is his big fingerprint? It is Tiananmen Square massacre. In 1989, as the promise of Chinese development was spoken about, and as the West opened its door, the young Chinese students in China were looking forward to the opportunity that for the first time they can maybe have a sense of freedom. Freedom that is based upon individual right. And it was that the Chinese prisoner of conscience who was given the Nobel Peace Prize. In his case, it was the right Nobel Peace Prize as opposed to Obama, who got the Nobel Peace Prize without, for what, we don't know. But Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, and he's famously said, you know, freedom of speech is the mother of all freedom. And so the struggle for free speech, the struggle for freedom, the struggle for the blossoming of the ability of the Chinese people with 5,000-year-old civilization, their poetry, their music, their philosophy, to be able to articulate themselves, that was crushed in Tiananmen Square massacre. Yes. And what did the Western governments, including Canadian government at that time, in 1989, it was Brian Mulroney, a conservative, a progressive conservative prime minister, followed by liberal prime minister, Jean Chrétien. What did they do, including the American president? In 1989, George Herbert Walker Bush was the president. Reagan was gone, Bush 41. And all the presidents after him, both Democrats and Republicans, until Trump gets elected in China, what did they do? They didn't hold Deng Xiaoping accountable. They didn't hold the Chinese communists accountable for the massacre that was done on a daylight. Remember, Bob, that iconic picture of the lone student standing in the front of a line of tanks?
Of course, it's iconic.
And
yes.
you can never forget that picture. That captures everything about what we are dealing with. We are dealing with the ultimate form of a totalitarian state with all the modern instrument of control that they have. And the Western governments, America, the land of the brave and the free, the beacon of freedom, we embraced China. We didn't punish China. The argument was that by opening our doors to China, by embracing China, we will help China become democratic,
or at least
liberal.
Modern.
And that was the phoniest argument we can see now, you know, that was used. And in the process, this great robbery, you might say, took place, where the American business transferred its productions and has turned out to be dependent. And what was the return for it, Robert? That we, the people, that you say we the people, yes, we the people, the Americans, the Canadians, what were we, the people, dealt with or given in this highway robbery? We were given the Dollarama, right? What should you worry? You can go and get what you want in a dollar store, as everything was shifted in terms of a main consumer item. So Walmart, Costco, the entire supply chain is China, you know. And there we are now confronted with it. As the coronavirus spread inside China, as the Chinese lockdown, or first the holiday break with the Chinese Lunar Year at the end of January led to the lockdown and not opening up the Chinese industries and factories, and China started holding back in exporting its inventory or its production because of its own needs. We run into this whole problem that is those of us, that is the Western countries, that have basically grown into this dependency relationship with the supply chain, particularly the Europeans, the Germans, the Italians, the French, and we are now paying the price.
Can we turn our focus now to what we're doing here domestically in Canada, and Trudeau, and in this province, Doug Ford's Ontario, who has just yesterday closed bars and restaurants, theaters, many places of gathering like that, sports events. And look at Trudeau, what he's done, very reluctantly, I would think, closing the travel, except, of course, for Roxham Road, where they can come across with impunity. And I want to ask you the question, is what you're seeing overkill? Is it too much, or is it not enough? And I ask that question because at the end of the day, if we find out in the future that there were a few cases in Canada, And there are a few deaths in Canada, right? As of this recording, there was 10 to my knowledge. People will say that that was either because the virus wasn't as virulent as it was led it to be, or because the measures that were put in place by our leaders were effective. So it's difficult to say whether or not, at least from my point of view, whether or not what they're doing is proper or overkill. What do you think?
Well, I mean, where do we get the information from? I mean, any of these
We
issues.
just talked about that, yeah.
Yeah, we get the information from the mainstream corporate media. And in the case of Canada, the mainstream corporate media was bought out by the Liberal Party last year. And it was bought out by the Liberal Party with the $600 million payment on not only as an act, independent policy act of the Liberal government ahead of the 2019 election, but it was also bought out in keeping with, consistent with the requirement laid out by the UN Global Compact on Migration that laid out the principle. If I remember correctly, the article, it was a document with 30 articles, 30 plus articles, laying down the whole scheme of the UN global migration, which Canada signed on to, that Justin Trudeau signed on to, without, by the way, any discussion in the Parliament. And so therefore it had no motion in the Parliament, no vote in the Parliament, and therefore it was a unilateral act of the Prime Minister and his PMO and the Liberal Party, and the country has gone along with it. It was, I think, Article 17 that called for that the media must be monitored and media must report what is being reported by the UN and in conjunction with the UN. And if anything goes against in contradictory or critical of what is the UN information and UN approved information, ranging from whether it's now the health issue, the migration issue, to Islamophobia issue, remember, then that would be then a offense according to the UN Compact Agreement. So there you have it. Is our media open? Is our media a free-flowing media that has a range of discussion taking place? Or is it a media simply giving an information that serves the purposes of a certain group of people with a certain agenda?
You bring up the point of this supply chain economically with China, but here we have an information chain starting with China and their disreputable government, going through the World Health Organization and its communist leader or director, and to Trudeau, who's a lover of Fidel Castro, of Cuba, communist Cuba, of communist China, whose policies are overtly socialist. And now finally to the mainstream media, if we want to call them that, the corporate media, I like that term better, the corporate media who are singing the tune of the United Nations and Justin Trudeau and the Communist Party of China and the World Health Organization without the proper vetting of that information, as we've just done here, looking at this leadership and the faults of the information chain. So given all of that dubious information, is what Trudeau is doing, proper, do you think?
No, it is not. I mean, the quick answer is no, he's not doing properly. We cannot rely on the CBC, which is the mouthpiece of the Liberal Party or of the Laurentian elite. And we cannot rely on any of these, Toronto Star or Globe and Mail, and whatever they're reporting.
So what should Trudeau be doing?
Well, you're asking whether your opening question on this matter was whether this pandemic is orchestrated and therefore fabricated, or is it real, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the two polarity. How seriously should we take it?
Well, there are people dying, there's no question of that.
That's right. So how serious it is and so on. And that's where we enter into an arena of uncharted water, so to speak, you know. When we turn around, I mean, to me, between the World Health Organization and their reporting, given what we have already pointed out, the role of the executive director and the background, you know, that it is somewhat stained or tainted, the reporting from the World Health Organization. So on the one hand, I mean, what does a country like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Laos or Vietnam or any of the African countries, where will they turn for their information? Where will they turn for their guidance, you know, for their epidemiological tests and so on and so forth? Where will they turn? They will turn to the World Health Organization, you know, and it's only logical, you know, they are going to rely upon UN agency.
Well, they also rely on American news channels as well.
That's what I say. This is for me, between that and we have that information, we can access it. I'm holding the iPhone in my hand, the computer in my hand, and I run the numbers by. And then you have the task force that President Trump put together 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago, with the people from the National Institute of Health and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Fauci, who is the executive director, from the Center for Disease Control, CDC, their director, you know, so all the various experts that he has pulled together and appointed Vice President Pence as the chair of that task force, and their daily briefing that is taking place and their monitoring. So between these two, to take as an example, I'm going to rely on the task force that the President Trump has put together, right? And I'll look at what they are saying. Well, the President is taking this matter very seriously. The measures that they have taken at the federal level, at the level in which the President has the jurisdiction and the operation, he has laid down the guidelines for the rest of the country to follow. He has spoken to the nation in a special televised address, and he has given out what his experts have told him, the step that has to be taken or need to be taken at the personal level of our own personal hygiene, and in the public level in terms of the lockdowns that have taken place, or schools and colleges that have been shut, and so on and so forth taken place. But ironically, Robert, the very people who were saying, that's the Democratic Party, the mainstream media, the corporate media, the talking heads on the CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, what they were saying 6 weeks ago, and some of them are still saying that this is xenophobic when President Trump put the ban on flights coming out of China. That was January 31. We live in the universe of 10-second soundbite and a very rapidly moving thing, and people are not keeping track of events, you know. It fades away very fast. That was the President's action on January 31st. And he mobilized his task force immediately after, and he started talking about doing the thing that is necessary to be done. But he clearly said, don't panic. The stock market was still on an upward slope in early January. And then the very same people who were calling Trump xenophobic and racist in that sense, that he is talking about China and focusing on China, are now 6-8 weeks later saying he's not doing enough. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat, and Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, they come out saying that Trump is showing towering incompetence. The question then to them is, Mr. Schumer, Madam Pelosi, what would you have done and what would you do? But there's no answer, right? So again, what has emerged and what we can see now very clearly, and we need to talk about that, is that what Rahm Emanuel said famously, every crisis, don't let it go waste. You know,
And he prefaced that or followed that up with saying that by this I mean you can get away with things under a crisis that you couldn't get away with before.
right. So every crisis should not be wasted. There is an opportunity to do something. And so the coronavirus eruption has become now the latest instrument in the hand of the corporate media, the Democrats, the never-Trumpers. What did the never-Trumper,
David Frum.
David Frum, what did he say yesterday? What did he say?
Well, he chided President Trump, excuse me, for correctly calling the coronavirus the Chinese coronavirus. And it's funny that he chided him for doing that on Twitter, and then somebody went back into David Frum's Twitter account and found out that he himself called it the China or the Chinese coronavirus.
But you found out, you know, you did the research, but what did he say? What did David Trump say?
Well, xenophobia,
he said that he said Trump is a racist. He's calling it Wuhan virus. We should call it Trump plague.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So the never-Trumpers, the Democrats, the corporate media, for them is what Rahm Emanuel is, that never let a crisis go waste. Okay?
They're counting on the fact that people have short memories as well. People have short memories. For example, if Pelosi comes out at one point in time and says we shouldn't be doing X, and then 3 weeks later she's saying that we should have done X, it's because she knows that the media, first of all, will be behind her, and that the population don't remember what she said 3 weeks ago.
Correct. So the point I'm making is that in the media, 6 weeks ago they were saying that this is xenophobic, the ban of flights coming out. Now just about every country is exercising the right to control travel, including Canada, except for the Roxham Road, which is still open, and we can talk about that. But the point is, the Europeans that had created the model of a borderless world, that is the Schengen area in Europe, and free movement of people without any documentation. Well, immediately as this thing erupted and it hit Italy and Austria, the two worst affected, the Austrian government put the border control.
So this has
now
been a big
Italy
blow.
has put the border control, and as of yesterday, all of the European countries have put the border control.
So this has been a big blow to the globalist agenda, do you think?
Well, I mean, the question is whether 6 months from now people will remember that and say, yes, you know, we need a nation state, we need borders, we need control, we need to know who is coming in, who is not coming in, because that was what was the very first thing that Trump said in the 2016 campaign, you know, when he came down the famous escalator in Trump Tower in 2015. He said, I'm going to build the wall. Building the wall means having a border. What is the Democrats' response? The borderless world. No border. That's xenophobia. That's you know, Trump's basically American isolation and so on and so forth. But coming back to the point, I can't let go. You raised the issue. You pointed out David Trump. David Trump's point. He's the guy who took the credit for axis of evil.
I knew you were going to say that, yes.
Right? So there is David Frum in 2000, whatever it was, 2004, no, it was 2009, after
Right
9/11,
yeah.
immediately after 9/11. So 2002, I think, 2002, 2003, in Bush's speech, he used the word axis of evil. And here he's coming around saying it is Trump's plague. You know, and there is no sense of irony in him, and no sense of self-reflection.
I don't know if it's worth. I don't know if it's worth even wasting our breath on the absurdity of the name of the virus, and people saying, "Don't call it the Wu flu, don't call it the Kung flu, don't call it the Chinese coronavirus." And yet, we have all of these other viruses named after the place of origin, from the Ebola to Lyme disease, as you correctly pointed out in a conversation with me just recently.
West Nile
West Nile virus, but you can't call this the Chinese
the
coronavirus.
The MERS issue, which emerged out of Saudi Arabia, from the camel to man, the Middle East respiratory syndrome. So yeah, I mean, and so now these people are running around saying, but who are these people? The talking heads on CNN, or David Frum, a talking head, or writing for, who does he write for now? The Atlantic Monthly. These are all the coastal elites. These are the blue states. These are the never-Trumpers, the neoconservatives, anti-Trump people. And who are financing them? The globalists, the Mike Bloombergs, the Jeff Bezos, the George Soros, the Bill Gates. We know this is the Davos crowd. This is the globalist agenda. They are the ones who are protective of China, because they are the ones who transferred their assets or their productions, their companies to China, and who made the bundle of money for themselves, the billionaire, the Bezos, the Soros, the Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg's wealth comes out of China and the Chinese trade. And so there they are protecting the China and castigating President Trump. So there is that other dimension of this virus, that is the political dimension. So never let a crisis go to waste. Now pin coronavirus to Trump to defeat him, right? This is the election year and so on. Well, on that issue about the Wuhan virus or the Wuhan flu, in terms of virology, this nCoV-19 is simply a new version of what was SARS.
They're both coronaviruses, yes.
Both are coronaviruses, right? So SARS, or avian flu, in 2003, which caused a pandemic, well, it was contained and it was done with and eliminated within the cycle of a flu season. It didn't go beyond 2003, and it was over. So maybe I can speculate that coronavirus 19 will go through this cycle and die on November the 3rd, 2020, with the election over in America.
It's
and
true.
until then, it will be all, a constant cycle of trying to create and orchestrate a panic.
That's true, because it wasn't an issue during the impeachment circus. It wasn't brought up at all, really. Or I shouldn't say at all, but it certainly wasn't given the attention that it really deserved during the impeachment. And certainly after the election, it'll probably not be talked about again. Hopefully, it will have run its course long before then. They're saying July, August now, but who knows? And because sometimes these viruses have a second wave or a resurgence, like the Spanish flu.
But if it comes back second wave, the whole body of people will have developed immunity.
But then again, with the Spanish flu, the second wave, I understand, was more dangerous than the first wave. But again, we're talking about a different organism here, so who knows?
But just hold on your thoughts there on the question of the impeachment. I mean, we talked about earlier on that now we know from the timeline of Dr. Liangs' death and his identification of the problem in December, and reporting on that to the Chinese authority, who then arrested him and put him in quarantine and imprisoned him, and he died in prison. That the origin of coronavirus problem erupted not in December, but possibly in the fall, going back into November and October. So the lead time takes us back then. Now, what was happening in America? Even as Liangs died, and that news came out in the BBC and the world news, and yet, you know, people were hazy about this because the Chinese were not talking. The Democrat Party, during that Christmas, just before the Christmas break, was busy with their fake impeachment articles, the two articles of impeachment that they were bringing together, and they were debating it, and they moved it. And then while President Trump was putting a travel ban on January 31st, the Democrat had moved the articles of impeachment to the Senate, and the Senate was involved in the impeachment debate or trial. And remember, Trump was busy trying to deal with the coronavirus based upon the information that was available in January. These guys were busy with the trial of Trump, impeachment trial, and the vote of the Senate took place on, if I remember correctly, on the first week of February 3rd, I think it was, after Trump had made the ban on travel out of China. So we can go back and point out that the Democrats who are now, and their cohort and their accomplices who are saying that Trump is a towering incompetence in dealing with this, while Trump was dealing with it, they had totally ignored this issue.
Yes.
In fact, they were doing everything to undermine the administration, not only in December of 2019, leading up to the trial that took place in January and the vote took place in February. The entire 3.5 years, now we are in the 4th year of the Trump administration, they had been doing the Russia Mueller thing, the Ukraine thing. It's been one after the other. The Stormy Daniels scandal. So they were fabricating and manufacturing ways to impeach and remove Trump from office. And this coronavirus orchestration of the panic is not totally, you know, something that is a matter of conspiracy theory, as people will say and try to dismiss it. It flows into, this is a convergence, it flows into the hostile action of the anti-Trump forces in America, aligned with the anti-Trump forces in the world, which is basically the globalists, you know, the Davos crowd. And they are bent upon, and this is where you might say that the Chinese themselves, that the Chinese leadership, and by the way, the Chinese leadership only this past 10 days have gone on public record from the highest level, that is from the level of Xi Jinping's spokesman and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including the Chinese ambassador in the United States, talking about that the Wuhan crisis was actually brought about by the Americans who released the germs in China by the American military.
Yes.
So the Chinese have gone the other way around through the United Nations and through their friends around the world, which comes back to the WHO, the executive director, with his connection to sort of, you know, become mask the Chinese responsibility, the Chinese accountability, and shift the responsibility towards the American.
Let's end off our discussion, if you would, Salim, with some lessons that I think that we can perhaps learn from this entire situation of the coronavirus. Because I can think of perhaps a couple. One would be that we've seen in the United States that President Trump is lifting a lot of the restrictions and regulations which have been put in place, preventing healthcare professionals from doing their job properly, researchers from coming up with vaccines quick enough. And with those lifting of restrictions, we're seeing already clinical trials for a vaccine, and manufacturing en masse of ventilators and things like that, where before, under the massive regulations that we see in all of our countries, things like that would take eons to come to market, right? Perhaps we can learn then that these regulations, if they're good today, they should have been good in the past, and they certainly will be good in the future, because they're simply regulations for the sake of regulations. Do you have anything that you think might come up that would be a good learning to take away from the
absolutely.
virus?
What it goes to show, and what Trump has done, and you're absolutely right, correct to point that out, but not only he's rapidly deregulating the restriction that have been put by the government, the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, going back, way back, on all of these industries, and Trump has been removing them, cutting the red tapes. By doing that, he's releasing the energy of the free market, of the private sector. And he has said it very clearly that this has to be a public-private sector cooperation. So there is a role of the government to monitor, to put the standards together. And then there's a role of the private sector to immediately respond as situations shift, as markets shift, as new situation emerges, to respond accordingly. And the free market will do that, which leads to the observation, the larger point I want to make is that the China's communist system is an anti-free market system. Though it is taking the benefit of the free market as through the World Trade Organization and in global trade, where people, that is, advanced countries, started investing in China and parking their industries and turning the supply chain around because of the immense profits to be made as a result of the cost of labor and so on and so forth that the Chinese offer to the multinational corporation. But having said that, the Chinese system is a heavily controlled system, as was the Soviet system, as any socialist system is. And given that, we can see that this coronavirus disease or any other disease or failure of the system, the government will try to control it, not to be transparent, not to share the information, and not to act rapidly enough. So by delaying the information and not providing the correct information, Americans or Europeans or other countries, the Japanese next door, could not develop fast enough with the information what is to be done. In this case, developing the vaccine. Even though the Israelis have come up with it and they're testing the vaccine, CDC recently this week announced that they are in the first phase of testing the vaccine.
There are some Canadian scientists who have isolated the vaccine.
Exactly. At Sunnybrook Medical Research Center, they have done it. So they're going to come up with it, which leads to the following observation, that analogous to diseases, famines are not simply a result of crop failure. Famines are actually the results of the failure of the trading and distribution system. So in an open society, you don't see famines. The system responds, the market responds. So we don't have famines in North America. We had problems during the Depression year with the Dust Bowl and so on and so forth. But we don't have famine like it was created in Soviet Union, the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine. Ethiopia is a country of famines, and we know that in our lifetime. China. The writing on this issue was done by economists of Indian origin, Amartya Sen, who got the Nobel Prize for this in economics, who pointed out that a free society now does not suffer from famines. It's only a closed society that suffers from famines. And you can see India, which is a poor country, but has tackled famines. It hasn't suffered from famines, which the Chinese have, and these famines were created by the authoritarian government. And so back to the coronavirus, they, if not directly responsible for infecting their own people, but by their actions, they are responsible and accountable of what happened and what followed. And the only question is whether people are going to hold them responsible. One other point I want to make, before we sort of wrap this up, is as of this point in time, and I'm looking at the figure, the Johns Hopkins figures, right now, the global infected rate, total confirmed numbers of people infected with coronavirus is 204,405. Let's round it off, say 205,000. 205,000 in a population, global population of close to 8 billion is a fraction of 1%. It is not even 1%. It's a fraction of 1%. The Chinese, I've talked about it, they have the largest number of infected. The figure is, I'm rounding it off, 81,000. And the number of death is 3,200 plus. That's again in the ballpark of 1%, death rate. Now, this is where the context and the perspective comes in. In 2009, the H1N1 swine flu infected something like 16 million Americans. Obama was the president. You have to dig deep and think hard to remember H1N1 swine flu. 16 million Americans were infected, and the death toll was 12,000 plus. The coronavirus is the figure as of this hour, as we are speaking, the figure is 6,000 Americans infected, 6,200 to be precise, 6,200 Americans infected, and death is 107, which is again a fraction of 1%. The largest number of deaths were in the state of Washington, and half of that, 107 is being reported. State of Washington is around about 54 deaths in state of Washington. Half of that was in Seattle in a
retirement
old home clinical center, where people died. That age group, 80 plus.
Are you suggesting perhaps then the virus is not as dangerous as we would be led to believe?
We have been led to believe in the basis of what information has come out of China.
And we've already talked about that kind of information.
And neither you and I have any reason to be doubtful about the words from the National Institute of Health and Infectious Disease, Dr. Fauci, or from the Center for Disease Control in America. They have been warning us, and the warning is that so far as they have tabulated the spread, being infected and the spread is where the fear is. It is exponential. That one person can infect 2.3%, and that's where they've laid down the social distancing, shut down the school, and hopefully that is going to kill the virus, contain the virus, kill it by the time that people are back again in operation, hopefully by mid-April. And there again, Trump has done, at the federal level, he's laid the guideline, he's mobilized the federal response team, but he's also said that the states, individual states, and the authorities of individual states and the main cities, they have to take up their responsibility and act. And so we can see San Francisco is in a lockdown, not because Trump has ordered it. It's the mayor of San Francisco. The mayor, de Blasio of New York, he's gone into a lockdown.
He's actually come out and spoken positively of Trump, which is quite
Precisely.
a turnaround.
So here it is, democracy in action, the local, and which goes to show you in terms of, again, putting it in context, that in a globalist environment, no one is responsible, no one is accountable. Whereas in a nation state, and here it is America, America is a continental country, 50 states, Hawaii is of course outside the continent, way out there in the Pacific. Alaska is not contiguous to the 48 state mainland, but nevertheless it is part of North American context. But it is a state, a nation state, operating under its constitutional authority, the government, in this case the Trump administration. People are responsible. The state government is taking place. For instance, Ohio, yesterday there was primary, the Democratic primaries, Republican primaries too, but there's only President Trump there. But on the Republican side, on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are now the two contenders standing. And you had the primary in Florida, in Arizona, and Ohio, and there's one other state is just escaping my mind now. But Ohio, the governor called the primary off, whereas in Florida it took place, in Arizona it took place, and the third place, the state, the name escaped. Oh, Illinois. Illinois, Florida, and Arizona, the primaries took place. Ohio shut it down because of coronavirus. Mm-hmm. So you see, it was left to the states, individual states, and their administrative responsibility.
Much as in Canada, healthcare is constitutionally a provincial affair.
Exactly.
And in this province, Ontario, we've seen the Premier act differently than in other jurisdictions. Like I just said, he's closed bars and restaurants,
right,
and theaters and the like, and sporting events. And
colleges, universities, schools.
Yeah, and I remember that I did a show recently, actually last year at some point in time, about the hallway medicine in Ontario hospitals. People are afraid of the virus, I think, not so much about the virus, because people get the flu all the time, and tens of thousands of Americans die from the regular flu every year, not to diminish the seriousness of catching the darn thing. But I think people are concerned about flattening the curve in a system, a state-funded, effectively state-controlled system, which has always been at its peak, if not beyond that, with hallway medicine. There are pictures, especially in Hamilton, of the hospital there, people out in the hallway getting their treatment because there's not enough beds. Routinely, people we're in London, being flown by helicopter to other jurisdictions because there are not enough ICU beds, not enough beds. And this is a system, we're talking about communism a lot here, this is a communistic system. Without question. And I wonder whether or not we would have this fair if the healthcare system was allowed to operate in a free market, which, as we've already said, responds quickly so that there are no famines, so that people get what they want when they want it, and it turns around on a dime much quicker than when Justin Trudeau says he admires the communist Chinese because they can turn their things around on a dime, which doesn't seem to be the case. They may be able to build a facade, a Potemkin hospital in Wuhan, but that's not doing anybody any good if there aren't enough nurses, aren't enough doctors, aren't enough ventilators, aren't enough equipment, and enough medicines. So I think another takeaway point, positive, from this issue would be the reliance we have on a failing healthcare system.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The silver lining in all of this thing is number of issues have arisen, and hopefully, people, you and I are having this conversation, and hopefully it will trigger a conversation across our country, among people, and then institutionally. So the silver lining is here is on the issue that you have raised is there is the medical crisis that is the virus. One little virus has upturned the world, and the world is responding. Out of 195 countries in the United Nations, 147, according to the current report, 147 nation states are reporting that confirmed cases, whether there's a dozen case or whether there is 80,000 as in China. So this is a global issue now. Iceland, so far removed from everywhere else, has reported something like 200 cases.
Is that right?
Iceland. So yes, there is a medical crisis, and we have to develop the response, and we are in that sense in the uncharted sea, and people are working it out, and so we can see President Trump's team responding accordingly. But there is another crisis which is far more challenging, which is the crisis of the medical system. And that leads to the whole issue, at least specifically in the case of Canada right now, and in the European system, in an open border world where people are moving and they are not documented, we don't know where they're coming from, what infection they are bringing. Nobody has been tested. That's what resulted with the huge spike in the case of Italy. And it is being followed by other countries. Spain has gone into a lockdown. France is almost in a lockdown. Germany will possibly follow. And by the way, it was Angela Merkel last week saying she's the one who has been the last of the leaders willing to close her border, because that will go completely against her open border policy.
No, she has already done it, though. The borders of Austria and France and Netherlands.
Yeah, but it was the problem that began with the open border and the migration from Middle East in 2015. She is the author of that. And she has been the last to even pay attention to the issue of closing border, that is reversing the Schengen agreement. But she said last week that Germany could potentially be affected to 70% of the population. 70% of Germany means around about between 58 and 60 million people. And so it is not only 58 to 60 million Germans are infected by this, it leads to the question of the crisis of the medical system. And so here we are right now in Canada. Our system has been overstretched long before this crisis. This has been the number one issue in our provincial politics and in our federal politics.
It's a
the wait
perennial
time.
issue. Every year it comes up, yes.
The wait time, we all know that, sitting in the in medical clinics, going in there, the wait time issue, the lack of hospital bed, the shortages of specialists and doctors,
And nurses, yes.
And nurses. And here we have a government that has still continued to bring in people. The immigration number is not changing. Bill Blair, the minister responsible for public safety, has said that people are going to be coming in. Roxham Road has not been closed. The premier of Quebec is almost screaming in the top of his voice to close the Roxham Road, because Quebec is now on the front line of the receiving end of asylum seekers walking across from New York, or people going from Canada to New York to bring these people in, and then dumping them on the provincial healthcare system. So there is that medical health crisis, a system crisis, that is the silver lining that we now know. I think people hopefully will awaken to that. the issue of migration and immigration. And of course, in the largest sense, you and I have been talking about this on a number of occasions, that is about globalism as an ideology. And what does it lead to? The unraveling of our tradition, our system, our government, and people to be held accountable and responsible for their policies and for their actions.
Thank you, Salim. Let's leave it there because this is a developing issue, and I think we'll talk again about it perhaps once it's settled a bit. But until then, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this.